guys like to start it, want to do introductions maybe?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's start with that.
Sure.
People go around that way.
Okay, sounds good. I'm Stacy Minahan. I'm a PWS and principal at Beals and Thomas, and we're excited to be here. Thanks for inviting us. Professional lab scientists. Yep.
And you guys, Rebecca Davis, conservation agent here in Wakefield.
I brought Romano, see, I've been on the commission. Actually, 20 years. My anniversary was this last week.
But I got off and Bob got on, that's right.
Yeah, and you came back, and I took your spot in 1999. Yes. Okay. Village commission 4 years ago.
I'm Haley. I'm a commission in about a year.
I'm always, yes, I've been. Almost.
Thermal, Jim was young. Wow.
Commission.
Years ago, maybe. I don't know.
This is his fourth decade. Not the agent, but.
I'm Peter Miller, and I've been on the commission for 13 years.
Nice.
And I'm Trenta Monty, and I was on the commission probably from 1994 to
99,
All right,
December 99.
when my daughters were young and I got off, and then came back on again, 5.5 years ago.
All right.
And I am Paula Thompson. I'm from Beals and Thomas, and I'm a professional engineer and lead accredited professional and sites accredited professional. That's another certification for sustainable sites instead of sustainable building, which is LEED. And I'm an associate.
Paula oversees our kind of QA/QC at the company, and she is the PE, the engineer that I go to every time I have a
The
question
QA,
or
I'm sorry, the QA.
quality assurance.
Oh, of course, for the old QAC.
Yeah.
QAQC. Right, if we say any acronyms, please just stop.
We will.
For sure. We
But
do it all the time.
yes, speaking in code, but no, we're really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting us. Thanks Rebecca for inviting us. Alicia Galen, the DEP circuit writer, she runs a series of workshops over the course of the year, and she had invited us to give a presentation on stormwater to commissioners, which we did, and then Rebecca followed up after and asked us to give it here, so we're happy to. So we have a presentation, and we looked at some things specific to Wakefield, but I wanted to just start off and see if anyone had any specific stormwater related questions or topics that you either wanted to talk about first, or if you want to mention them, and we'll try and keep them in mind as we go, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions too. Yeah.
Do you consider roof runoff being that up?
Yeah, actually, that's a good, so that gets into the presentation, but I will take a minute now since we're jumping ahead. So Beals and Thomas is a multidisciplinary firm. We have civil engineering, land surveying, landscape architecture, land use permitting, environmental planning, and wetland science. Our clients are a range of, commercial campuses, commercial developers, residential developers, solar developers, nonprofit organizations, restoration specialists. So we kind of run the gamut on the type of work that we do. We also do a lot of municipal work, a lot of trails, park projects, and a lot of peer review as well. We have contracts, I think, with 5 municipalities right now for we're their consultant of peer reviewer that they go to. We have a long-term contract. And then we also have multiple towns where we don't have a formal contract, but we'll do reviews if something comes up, or sometimes there's a one-off really complicated project that a town needs help with. So
So if you're under contract with one of those towns, does that mean you can't represent a developer?
that's a great question.
Not in that town, I would think.
Well, it depends. So I am gonna say, I'll start off by saying I'm not an attorney, so I cannot answer that question definitively. There is an ethics line at the state that you can call to ask if you're ever concerned about a conflict of interest. They have on-call attorneys. Generally speaking, we try not to be doing a lot of work in a town that we're representing, and certainly not at the same time. So I would never be in front of a conservation commission doing a peer review and then sit back down in my seat and then step up 2 hearings later and represent a developer. There are timeframes depending on, it all boils down to whether you as a peer reviewer are considered a employee of the town, a special town employee. Most of our contracts where we have contracts with towns specify that we are not considered a town employee. But that's a great question, and actually, so I'm president of the Association of Mass Wetland Scientists. We just had our annual conference, and we had a panel on peer review, and that was one of the questions that came up, and it ran the gamut of, there was one person in the room who did what I just described at the beginning. It was like, oh, I do that all the time. We're like, well, definitely don't do that. That's the one thing that's very clear that you should not be doing.
Yeah, we can do the conflict of interest training.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
As commissioners.
Yep, yeah. But it's a little less clear. I mean, we do have, for example, there's a town where we have done long-term peer reviews for the planning board. We've occasionally done peer reviews once in a while for the conservation commission, but much less frequently. We have a long-term client in that town as well that doesn't typically get represented before those boards.
Can you tell us which towns, by the way? I mean,
Oh, sure. Yeah, so our contracts, our long-term on-call contracts, Plymouth, North Attleboro, Quincy, Rentham. We don't have a contract, but we've been doing a lot of work for Harvard recently. Liz Allard, I don't know if you know her, she's active in MACC, she's the agent there. Other towns do we do? Attleboro, Plymouth, Rentham, Quincy.
I don't know, I try not to do them anymore.
Yeah. I think those are most, if not all of the kind of constant, and some of them we've been doing since before I started at the firm 20 years ago. Some of them are shorter, but even, I would say 10+ years for most of the towns that we've been working for. We've done Worcester, we don't do peer reviews, but we do a lot of parks and trails projects. I think Holliston, we've done a lot of trail projects, so we kind of go all over the state. And then there'll be some one-off reviews, right? Like I got a call from, it's been a while since I did the review, so I'm not gonna remember the town, but it was in Western Mass, and they had a solar project that had received all its permits. It was going to construction, and they were very concerned about the construction period because the permitting process had not been smooth. And so they hired us to be the construction, perform construction administration for them. I think the benefit from our perspective is we're practitioners and peer reviewers, right? We don't only do peer review. If I'm reviewing a solar project that someone is proposing on behalf of a town, I have also represented solar developers and helped ensure their compliance with the Wetlands Protection Act. So, we have a broad perspective as opposed to someone who just does solar projects or just does peer review or something like that.
So the towns where you have represented for a long time.
Yeah.
Can I just add, I mean, what we're finding is that we really hadn't been using peer reviewers very often. Things are getting more complicated.
Yes.
So I'm asking you questions about, do some of the towns just automatically hire you for things?
Go to peer review?
Or is it, 1 out of 3 times, or is it for anything of any complexity?
Sometimes it's for really anything of any complexity, like notice of intent and above, right? Maybe the agent will handle RDAs. Maybe if there's a complicated RDA, they'll bring us in on it. But if it's a notice of intent for anything other than a single family home, I'm thinking North Attleboro now, right? Like, yeah, so typically there,
See the menu of when,
Yeah. when people do it,
consider-
right? And every town is different in what they want, but
Are these
And
guys with an agent?
with an
With an
agent.
agent.
And how is it paid for? So we have a policy that's allowed under state law
Mhm.
that the applicant has to pay for your fees.
Yes. Yes, so it's called 53G. And the applicant, the commission solicits a proposal or proposals for the peer review services. Ideally, when you solicit proposals, it's good to have what you want for scope in mind, so that if you get multiple proposals, you're comparing apples to apples. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that sometimes some towns will look just at billing rates, right? Well, that doesn't mean what it's gonna cost. The other thing is, since it is 53G, you get the proposals, the commission votes to hire one of those as a peer reviewer. The applicant submits a check to the commission. That gets deposited in a separate account at the town. So nothing goes through us. We're not being paid by the applicant, because that would be a conflict. It gets deposited in a separate account. Peer review shouldn't start until that money is received and deposited, and then that is used to pay the peer
Yeah, and
reviewer
we've done
fees.
that.
Yeah, that's the standard way.
And is there not a more truncated thing if the amount, if the estimated cost is less than?
Yes,
Yes.
you
It-
only need to ask for one, if
Right,
it's a
if it's
certain
less than
value.
10,000,
and it's-
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
what we've done.
So can I ask you, when you have these, if you're in North Attleboro? and
Yeah.
Are most of them under 10,000?
Well, in North Attleboro, it's different because they decided, and most of our long haul long-term on-call are done by a contract, a long-term contract. So every 3 years, they go out to bid and they say, this town is soliciting proposals from consultants interested in providing peer review for a period of 3 years. Give us your scopes, your billing rates, and then we'll pick who we want to use. And sometimes, like in the case of North Attleboro, they actually have two. They have us and another firm that they switch between depending on kind of what the focus is and
So there you're not putting.
so we still give them a proposal. Each time a new project comes in that they want us to peer review, we give them a proposal specific to that project so that they can get the fees.
Right.
But they don't have to go out to bid because they've already selected us through a competitive process. Other towns where it's a one-off, or Harvard where we do them intermittently, but we don't have a contract. Yes, those fees are typically under $10,000. Typically, the peer review for even a complex notice of intent filing is gonna be less than $10,000. For our firm, I can't speak to others, unless it is super complex, the applicant is super unresponsive. You know, the only time I really see our peer reviews, fees getting above 10,000 is if we're doing a chapter 40B peer review for a zoning board of appeals. Is when for a first cut, like then it's probably gonna be over 10,000 to review, but otherwise they're almost entirely under 10,000.
But are those contracts for all kinds of things that you do? So it's not just conservation commission.
We do a lot of conservation commission peer reviews, planning board peer reviews, and
But
ZBA.
I mean, is your contract doing for all of those services? Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so there are some towns that hire us for North Attleboro, we do all of the boards there.
Gotcha.
Other towns, Harvard,
Maybe-
we only review for the conservation commission right now, so it just depends on what the town wants. If the town has multiple boards that are soliciting peer review, I would recommend coordinating to the extent that you can. Every town is different in terms of how the boards get along and all of that,
And
but.
I have no idea how much our town does peer review for like zoning board of appeals, right? I just can't, I have
No,
no,
I don't think very often.
I don't think so
We
either.
do a lot.
Yeah,
of
yeah.
ours,
Yeah.
Almost everything. to be
Mhm.
honest.
Yes,
Yeah.
anyway, so that's just
Yeah.
interesting to me to
Yeah.
have other towns
Mm.
approach things.
I mean, it's all,
One thing we get from you guys, we don't know what the other guys do.
right, yeah, no, we're happy to share. And I mean, I would recommend, even when I was on my commission, right, I was talking with Rebecca. We hired peer review and we had people that, we had a great agent. I was on the commission, we didn't have an engineer, but you're volunteer boards and you don't always have the technical expertise. And even if
How about you
you
never
do,
had a tech?
even if you do, but even if you do, you know, if Paula reviews something of mine that I prepare at Beals and Thomas, she's gonna have good comments.
Well, and
on
I'm
it.
looking at it a different way. too.
Right.
And actually, the presentation we have for you is going through the stormwater standards. And then discussing, you know, when you would ask for peer review.
Yeah,
If I was on the commission with, you know, if my mom was on a commission, I would want her to get a peer review. Like you just, you don't, you can't
Right.
possibly know as
Absolutely.
much
That's
as a peer review. You
And
can't
and
possibly.
also, in my business, you know, having two sets of eyes, is just
Right.
it's
Yes.
it's a
It's a-
process thing that prevents.
right,
It's a-
exactly.
It's a,
I have never been peer reviewed, like for the times, projects that I'm involved in at Beals and Thomas, for the times they're peer reviewed. It's never come back with no comments. There's always something, right?
Right.
And for the times we do peer review, there are always comments. There's never a time I've looked at something and said, oh, they did 100%.
Excuse me, you have to give some value for their money. You gotta say something.
Say nothing. Well, the applicant doesn't want any
Exactly,
comments, but.
why do we hire them if there's no
Right,
comments?
Right, but that,
We'll come up, no offense.
Yeah, no, but
Something.
the other point about peer review, since we're talking about it, though, is, you know, peer reviews really should not be mercenary, so.
Yeah.
I would not recommend only hiring peer review when there's a development project proposed that is very contentious and everyone dislikes it strongly and they just wanna quell it and not, you know, and deny it. That's not the reason to hire peer review,
No.
because the times that a project actually is deniable, I've seen it twice in
yeah.
my career of 20 years,
And
where I looked at something, I was like, wow, I don't think this is permittable.
Right. If we try to tell people that we work for, okay, we're not gonna be able to help you stop this
Right, we're trying
project
to-
if that's what you think we're gonna do. We can't do that because we're engineers. We can engineer anything. So we can tell them how to make their project better and how to comply. And so we take that perspective when we do reviews.
Right,
So
and
we
that
should-
is not the case with all peer reviewers. Different peer reviewers have different perspectives on what a peer review is, but that is my personal /
Yes.
professional and the Beals and Thomas approach to peer review.
We should get started with the
Okay,
presentation.
no, this is
So
great.
thank you.
Just- yeah, no.
Actually, this, I wanted to just understand.
Yeah.
No,
where
that's
you're
great.
coming from.
Okay,
Stormwater is probably our weakest.
Absolutely.
We rely on our town engineer. for
Yeah.
a lot of our-
Is that common, by the way, to be highly reliant on your town engineer? for stormwater?
That's like a point of what-
Some towns do. And some town engineers are PEs that have been in the field of development, and I think they do really understand it. Some, aren't as strong, and they're more of I do water and sewer, and I know what's in the roads, which is different from, the whole stormwater policy and standards.
so one thing I didn't want to forget to say is that what we're presenting are the current stormwater standards. You may have heard DEP has a resiliency package that actually is coming out, it's either the 20th, I think it's the 22nd of December. Long awaited, we've been hearing for years that it was gonna come out. I was on the advisory committee for it when they were thinking of the regulations. So that will change some of the specific details that we're presenting tonight, but it won't change how you the general reasons for stormwater. So I kind of went through this already in terms of framing our perspective and where we're coming from, and we've introduced ourselves already. You can always reach out with questions after this, obviously, if you think of something. So I'm gonna touch briefly on when the stormwater regulations apply under the state. Wakefield does not have a wetlands bylaw, but you do have a stormwater bylaw that we took a quick look at. And then I'll pass it to Paula, who will talk through the importance of stormwater and the requirements of the stormwater handbook. All right, so these are the 4 topics that we're doing. We've touched on peer review already, but we can continue the discussion after if you would like. So for stormwater, there are, as you know, legal obligations for conservation commissions to review stormwater and uphold compliance with stormwater management. I mean, it's honestly probably one of the most important aspects of a development in terms of potential environmental impact. Their stormwater is both environmental impact and impact to public health, safety, and welfare if the stormwater isn't managed properly. Obviously, stormwater discharges that aren't handled properly can impact all of the interests of the act, and so that's why it's important. There is, so any project that has stormwater that's discharging to a jurisdictional area is subject to the stormwater requirements. And I would say the full portion of the project site that is discharging to that jurisdictional area is subject. So correct me if you disagree, but if the parking lot is outside of jurisdiction, but it is discharging to a jurisdictional area, that parking lot needs to meet the stormwater standards, the runoff from the parking lot. If everything is outside of jurisdiction and the stormwater is discharging upgrading of the buffer zone, then it's not subject to the commission's jurisdiction immediately, if and until there's an actual impact to a resource area. But then once that impact occurs, then the commission has jurisdiction and can require a notice of intent filing or anything like that.
So can I ask a very elementary question? You're saying, so it has to do with discharge into an area within our jurisdiction. How do we know that from the file?
You will see, or maybe that you could ask the engineer to flag, but there will be a basin or a discharge pipe or a riprap swale or some
As you can see on the
stormwater
plan,
feature.
Going into an.
A buffer zone.
Right,
Okay.
into a buffer
So
zone,
you have to
something like that.
it's-
If you
We
could,
even get, and we've never had an NOI that didn't have, the traditional 100-foot buffer.
Yeah, so
Never
obviously-
had an NOI, and so we would have no idea whether something would come to our attention.
well, it would have to, because there'd be some feature that was in the buffer zone. And
Yeah,
they'd
we
have
have
to
to-
file with you
Otherwise,
for
we
that
would just-
feature.
Exactly, so no, exactly, so
Yeah.
you should be able to see it on the plan.
You should be able to see
Right,
it.
right. So
Now, there could be a scenario where if someone doesn't design it properly, the site is like changing flows or something and that's discharging to a buffer zone and they just aren't managing it. Do you know what I mean? And so you wouldn't see that it's in jurisdiction, but I feel like that would be a very one-off situation.
Well, I'm just thinking of a situation where like the planning board might see it for site plan, but it would never get to them until there was a problem.
Oh, yeah, if it's
I'm
upgraded.
Just saying,
upgraded,
it's a
upgraded.
situation where like there's a wetland that's off the property.
Right,
The
yep,
entire property is more than 100 feet away from that wetland.
Right.
mhm,
And they're gonna build on it, and that that wouldn't come to us. They would
No.
never file it, I know why. And
No,
yet
they would
that
not.
could- And that could be, and that could be within our jurisdiction, if it had, stormwater discharge to it.
Yes, if it had an
You could
illicit
anyway.
discharge, yeah, yeah, and so I'm gonna jump ahead, actually. Do
Yeah,
you wanna do, or do you want me
Yeah,
to?
well, I'm gonna just jump
Sure,
ahead.
yeah.
So, Wakefield does have a stormwater management bylaw. And what it, quick read through, but basically what it says is, if it's not subject to jurisdiction. And it's not gonna come to one of the town boards, they have to file under this bylaw.
It's not otherwise.
And under this bylaw, it says that you, the commission, will get a copy of it, so. So if a filing is ever filed under this bylaw, the commission gets a copy, so you will be able to see where the discharges are and you can.
I've never seen one. Nope.
Is it, would it only come,
If there was not a planning board
not a
filing,
planning board filing, right?
maybe,
Yeah, so it might
maybe
be
if there was
something that,
not any other filing, it would go through this.
And chances are they probably isn't planning for the plan.
Yeah.
Those kind of projects.
right,
I mean, generally.
Maybe not, maybe.
Yeah.
but again, you know. If something is outside of jurisdiction, it's outside of jurisdiction. Unless it impacts a resource area, and that's when you can
Right.
come in and see, you know, and take jurisdiction.
I think a lot of things that we see is if you have a project that has a part of it is in the buffer zone, right? And so probably more towards the end of pipes type of stuff is
Yep.
gonna be in that jurisdiction. However, contributing to that system could be things that are outside of the buffer zone, and you still evaluate those.
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So you are looking at those systems, even though if this parking lot or whatever it might be is out of the buffer zone because it filters down and goes eventually to your discharge point, you do look at that as also in addition to the management that is within your buffer zone. I think that's what you're saying, right?
That we have, upland projects, and those, you don't think of them as because they're not near wetlands. But that's why 1,000 cuts, the poor management of the uplands sends the water down to the.
But we can't do anything.
Right.
Well, no,
Because
but
that-
that's,
unless-
the-
Unless
Well,
it's
but
a-
that is this, and you would hope that your planning board is looking at those projects that could affect, and they have a bylaw and. You
I
know,
think
right.
the town engineer reviews
Yeah.
all of those.
Now, have you ever run across a project that failed? That there was a.
Yes, where someone took jurisdiction.
No, I'm saying a project that you altered a BBW or something. Have you
Sure.
ever run across that you went through this whole process and designed the system to, all your retention stuff and it still failed or it still worked?
Oh,
As
it's
design.
Like,
Yeah.
on
No.
final, not final
No,
condition,
it's
but
construction.
construction,
Only in construction.
Yeah.
generally in construction.
Construction part of it.
Yeah.
When
Yes.
The system was complete, you never had a problem.
I've never had a
Not that you
problem.
know.
Well, cause once the.
Not that anyone sued me for it.
Right.
Yeah.
a good thing.
Because I think once the project is complete, for the stormwater system to be considered complete, everything needs to be stable. So, so really, you're
Yeah.
still in construction phase until the site is stable.
Right.
So, but yes, I mean, that solar project that I was telling you about that we were brought in during the construction phase to provide construction admin, it was an awkward situation because we would have had a lot of comments during the peer review about the design because the design was problematic. And so they had a little basin in one area that was just undersized. And it was in the groundwater. And so it didn't function, properly. That's not a failure of the system, though. It's a failure in the design. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like if things are designed appropriately and constructed appropriately, they function. And what I typically hear, although I don't know if that's still the case, or if this was more, I'll say, old school engineering, like the John Bensley days, of big fields and stuff. Yeah. Everyone always talks about how oversized basins are already, anecdotally. So,
Yeah, I think I haven't found that more recently.
yeah, I think that's true. And especially when DEP comes out with the new stormwater standards, they're gonna be finally changing the rainfall data that
Oh,
is
good, yeah.
required. So most firms, I think it's fair to say, are using NOAA
Mhm.
Atlas 14 now. But that's not actually what's required. It's TR 55, which is the old data, but that will improve things as well.
Maybe it's good that the basins are oversized,
Right,
the
for
beginning.
climate
Right,
resiliency.
it's good.
No, it's right.
Yeah.
That's true.
Sorry, we
All
cut
right,
you off
no,
track.
no, that's great. So again, just to reiterate, stormwater regulations apply for work in the commission's jurisdiction, where you're looking not only at what is the work in your jurisdiction and how is it affecting all the other interests of the act, but also is the stormwater designed appropriately? But then also for aspects of the project that are out of your jurisdiction, but tributary to your jurisdiction, so draining to your jurisdiction. You're looking at those aspects of a project, not for habitat or the other interests, but you're looking at it for stormwater management. There are exceptions. I personally am hopeful that some of these exceptions will change when the new regs come out, because they aren't really tied to logic in some ways, but right now it's less than 4, yeah, single family houses are exempt, less than 4 house lots are exempt, and emergency repairs to roads or their drainage systems. The thing that drives me crazy is, okay, a restoration project. Do I need to do stormwater management for that? Like, it's not exempt. Anyway. And then they apply it to the maximum extent practicable to, less than 4 house lots if you're discharging to a critical area. 5 to 9 lots anywhere else, marinas and boatyards, and then pedestrian and non-motorized vehicle pathways. All right. And I think I'm trying to get over to you, Paul.
Easy, so we're start from the basics. What is stormwater? And it's pretty much anything that runs off, so your rainfall that runs off of surfaces and snow melt. So anything that's soaking into the ground is not considered stormwater, basically everything.
And maybe now's a good time. I don't think we ever answered the roof runoff question because we got really.
I
excited.
wanna-
You wanna?
I'm gonna get to that.
Okay.
Because it's part of one of the standards.
Perfect.
Why is stormwater important? It represents the single largest source responsible for water quality impairments in the Commonwealth. So definitely very important, as we talked about at the beginning. This is why it's important to get peer reviews and really review each project for all the standards. So what is stormwater management? So stormwater management is managing stormwater. So taking the stormwater, removing pollutants, controlling the flow and the volumes. It also includes maintenance, long-term operations of stormwater systems, and the Massachusetts Stormwater Handbook and policy, well, it used to be called policy, the regulations guide the design of these systems.
And maybe just to answer, Jim, the question you asked before about failure, I do think maintenance can be problematic for
Right.
stormwater management systems. And so you might not see a failure per se, but the stormwater management system isn't functioning the way it was intended.
Right.
I've seen that on especially older
Yeah,
sites.
more complex these systems are, the more maintenance they require.
Yes.
Passage of time.
In the passage of owners. Or owner.
Well, and it's interesting, because if you remember when the new regs came out with stormwater in the Wetlands Protection Act regulations, they went through a whole thing about if your basin was older than a certain time and it has grown wetland plants, oh, it now could be a wetland if you haven't been maintaining it. So it kind of talked about all of those things, you know, from the outlet out, that could be a wetland now because you're not maintaining these
Well,
things.
that's
So
a,
it's really
that's an
important.
incentive to maintain it.
It is, yeah, it is.
Yep.
Okay, why is stormwater management important? And this is something that Stacy just brought up, the interests of the act and what interests are important, how they relate to stormwater. So stormwater management reduces flooding. It can reduce demand on our public systems, supports healthy water bodies, and protects critical areas. And these are the interests of the act that could be related to stormwater. Okay, so let's get into each of the standards. So standard 1 says that no new conveyances may discharge untreated stormwater or cause erosion to water bodies. I always think it's funny that they kind of put those two together. The untreated part comes in a later standard, so we'll talk about that, or cause erosion to water bodies. A lot of times I feel like this isn't addressed, and it's something that you guys should really pay careful attention to. Where the outlets are, how much water is coming out of those outlets, and what is the engineer developer doing to protect the land from eroding downstream of those? So one thing I've seen during peer reviews is somebody shows a nice triangle outlet that's stone and there's the erosion control barrier. Well, really that outlet needs to be 20 feet long to dissipate the flows that are coming out. Cause you can get a lot of flow coming out of the basins and the outlets. And you really want to make sure that those are captured. If that's 20 feet long, well, now it's going way past the erosion control barrier. Now they're working even closer to the resource area. So something to pay attention to.
And that's something in peer review that I know we try and look at as well as, okay, so they've shown us where the limit of work is, but do we believe they can build it? And
In that limit of work.
right, and that we have a site right now where we're doing construction monitoring and a certain size riprap was specified, the contractor put in too small riprap and it's causing a problem. And so now they have to replace it with the right size riprap, but if you're not necessarily looking at that during construction, you might not notice it.
Yeah, some small stones, they're just gonna flow with all the water. Yeah, you've probably seen it before. So standard 2 is our post,
Oh,
oh,
sorry.
sorry. Post-development peak discharge has to be less than or equal to pre-development peak discharge rates. This is just the flow rate. So this is a little bit different than the volume of water that's coming off the site. So what this does is if you have so much flow at a property line or downstream property or resource area, proposed conditions, you hold water back and then slowly let it out so it matches the existing. So it's just the rate of water coming to that resource area or downstream property line. This is what the requirement is. Now, with impervious areas, you're actually going to increase the amount of water from the site because it's not seeping into the ground anymore. So impervious area, you have more water, so you're letting water out over a longer period of time. So it's generally more water. That's where standard 3 comes in.
How do you feel about impervious asphalt?
So
Pervious,
pervious,
I'm sorry,
pervious asphalt.
right.
So that kind of brings in
Pervious,
standard
sorry.
3. So standard 3 is recharge, and this is where we try to get water back into the ground because roof areas and impervious areas are gonna increase the volume of our flow, increase our rates, and so this is where you try to get it back into the ground. So this is using subsurface infiltration systems or infiltration basins. Hopefully, I don't know what Wakefield soils are like, but we have some challenging areas. We work in Hopkinton, it's all glacial till, but then we work in Plymouth and it's great sand, so very different. So we try to encourage pervious pavements, pervious pavers. They are extremely hard to maintain. So whenever you have that type of system, you actually have to vacuum it out at least annually. And you're vacuuming out all the sediment from sanding and salting. And it's pretty complex. And normally what happens is all your soil pores get clogged and you're getting runoff. It's pretty close to impervious again. There's a great stormwater center up at UNH, and they have done some great, they have actually online, you can watch them open a fire hose onto pervious asphalt.
See what happens?
Pervious asphalt, it all goes in, it's fantastic.
It goes
Like by the time they get to the end, there's no water coming up, but they are constantly maintaining that with a vacuum maintenance.
So that's what I
You
said.
can't flood it with like the fire hose and expect it to drive the particulates down through it.
No,
Okay,
yeah, or it will clog the little
It'll clog the
particulates will
pores.
clog the pores, yeah.
okay.
And so, I'm not gonna name the project, but the project before us now,
Oh,
it has
so it's the sub bid.
pervious asphalt.
Mhm.
And they're saying that they don't need to,
Ask a generic question.
I was just.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you have,
Sorry to
if
interrupt.
you have, pervious asphalt, do you need to, have snow removal from it, or does the snow just like melt into it and, how does that work?
Well, so snow isn't gonna melt in, only
Into-
what
oh,
melts is
right.
going to melt.
Right.
So you would probably be plowing that to the sides to, get your parking lot open. Under pervious asphalt, you would want a very good cross section, so you'd wanna know what all the materials are beneath it. You want really good draining materials, beneath pervious asphalt. And you would also wanna make sure that their operation and maintenance plan is very specific, and you're gonna wanna keep up with that, so maybe it's actually, I did write something down in my notes. There was a very good. Trying to think of what it was in, one of the volumes, it talked about what the commission can have as conditions. So operation and maintenance conditions, and they recommend that you put that in your order of conditions and put it in your certificate of compliance when that is issued, because that gets recorded at the registry and it requires them to do that maintenance, in the future.
You know, something, interesting. Or, couldn't you not consider any recharge benefit to that, just ignore it as though it's not previous payment, but regular payment? Because eventually, these people they're not gonna, it's not gonna.
It's possible.
Yeah, I think that might be a hard thing if the commission is saying, we're not gonna give you any credit for it, because you're sort of pre-penalizing. But I am not an attorney, so that would be for
Yeah.
them to weigh in on.
I would wonder if you could just
So
when
it's
they,
gonna fail sooner or
when they
later.
design the system, just allow for that. So it doesn't
Conservative.
exist. You know what I'm saying?
I think if you had it in a bylaw, you know, or then it would be easier. It's certainly something you could discuss with proponents. And to Paula's point, if you carry those conditions forward in the certificate of compliance, the problem with that is then the onus falls on the commission for enforcement when and if it's
Right.
not done. You know, and that's really what always is always.
Have you ever heard of putting conditions in the certificate of compliance?
Yes,
Do
there
they
are,
do that?
We reference conditions, perpetual.
I know, but
conditions.
they're saying actually put it actually in the certificate of compliance. So
That's-
you look
Well,
at-
you would reference the condition that speaks to ongoing maintenance of the stormwater system and whose responsibility.
Put it in the certificate of compliance?
Yeah, because it says special, yes, what I do is I write the number of the condition that it references, I don't rewrite the actual
I think
words.
you're saying to be right there.
That's how they describe it.
Right,
in
right,
the-
right,
in
right,
the
right.
book.
Just a thought.
either
Right.
works from a legal,
Yeah.
yeah, I think either works from a legal perspective. It's
Hopefully,
the
yeah.
same, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but you know, it makes sense to me that if it's referenced, then yes, but it is a little bit harder on
Yeah,
the
because
commission, you have to cross-reference
Right,
another
right,
document,
right, right.
but yeah, as long as they're, you know, references continuing. In terms of the snow removal question, just to make sure I was clear on what the question was, so from a stormwater management perspective, there's no need to remove the snow from the pervious pavement.
And, right,
But
from a use.
presumably they would be
Right,
removing the
exact-
snow
that's what I was
because
saying.
of the use, yeah, exactly, I wasn't sure what the question was.
But we wouldn't want them to be sanding that surface.
No, well,
Right.
that's.
Right.
Well, then,
really
yeah,
bad.
yeah,
That's
And
really bad.
don't,
Right.
That's
But should
especially-
we add a condition, even if it's in their O and M? Should we add a condition, we will not sand the impervious,
If you were,
I mean, the pervious.
Impervious,
asphalt.
Theoretically. Yeah, I think things like that are. Theoretically. I think things like that
That's
are
a project.
good to carry in conditions. Anything that, I mean, in theory, everything's on the plan and the plan is what is
Yeah, right.
approved in perpetuity, but the conditions are what. The
Gets
conditions are what, the commission and gets recorded. The plan doesn't get recorded. The contractor, I would say, not to generalize, but to generalize, is gonna look at the plan and not the conditions. So it's good for it to be in
Yeah,
both
I wonder if you have
places.
a better chance, just in terms of now, with, you know, a lot of these compliance things with title changes, you know, title searches pick this up.
Right, it would
Yeah,
pick it
that's
up,
what
And
exactly.
and I wonder if the title search will say that this, that, and the other. thing
It's a
shall-
continuing obligation. Have you
Yeah.
checked this out?
Yeah, have you certified that you complied with this continuing obligation?
It depends on the-
If you mention,
Right,
condition 17, 18, 19, and 22 or something,
it'll be missed.
then it'll be missed.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I
but you
have
can go
seen,
back to it though, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, because we're doing that right now. Like, so for instance, there was a lack of maintenance on a stormwater basin, then there was some flooding issues with some neighbors, and so then I contacted the property owner. And they're like, oh, I don't know what happened, but I'm able to go back and reference the ongoing condition that references maintenance and says, you are still absolutely on the hook for this, and then it gets the ball rolling. And then they're like, oh, okay, I'm on the hook for this.
Well, it
So
also-
even if they didn't catch it when there was a change of hands, because it's on the documentation, then I can refer back to it. And then
I see.
it really puts the responsibility still back on them to
You
take
get a
care
lot
of
of
it.
people that say, I
Sorry.
just didn't know, or I didn't. you know,
Right.
and-
yes.
And a lot of people don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but the
Yeah.
point is, it's more difficult to say when it's right, you just, get on the right, you just get on the internet and see it's right there. versus having to reference, it references another document. that you
Yeah.
have to- that has-
And I have seen title companies and financing companies get very nitpicky in, have you complied with every condition? Just depends on what the financing
Well, I
entity
wonder,
is.
you know what, all it takes is a little, some litigation, and they will, it's usually the third parties that sometimes are the ones that get, because they have, they have a reason to, they're the ones that, any third party who stands to lose is has an incentive to help get this enforced. That's okay.
So what's LID?
Oh, an acronym.
So LID is low impact development.
Come on.
I'm sorry.
You should have known that.
So
I
this,
know.
this is
The old
where
LID
you,
technique.
this is where we talk about pervious pavements and pervious, pavers or pavements or using grass areas to park cars, that type of thing. Mimicking natural conditions, so instead of having the whole site go down to one basin, you have multiple small basins, you have basins in islands in the middle of parking lots, and you do things all across the site instead of having one thing. way at a time. Yeah, yeah. So while we're on this standard, I want to talk about the clean roof runoff, because this is where, can I take my roof runoff and pop it right into the ground, and recharge that? So the regulations, the explanation of standards that is in volume 1, chapter 1, does outline this. They consider roof runoff to be clean. It does not need to be treated before it is infiltrated. Unless there is a metal roof. Metal roofs need pre-treatment. So that's what the regulations.
Metal roofs, I would think another comment, but maybe they are.
I think they're becoming more common.
No,
I'm seeing more and more of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
So metal roofs, what would, just from what's
So I believe it's,
Family home,
yeah, no, it
Correct.
wouldn't matter with a single family home.
it's only be metal roof on a commercial
Yeah,
structure. or
exactly.
infrastructure.
So I'm not sure if it's something I'm not sure exactly what it is.
Okay.
The reason.
Sure.
It might get into that in one of the,
What is it they're objecting to in metal roofs?
that's what I'm not quite sure on. I need to look up. So I do have, I still am old school. I do have it all paper. I do have it electronically too, but I do reference, so volume 1, chapter 1. If anybody wants to dig into it, of the handbook, there's a great section that is called explanation of standards. So it goes through each standard and it kind of goes, a lot deeper into each of these things that I'm talking about. So volume 1, chapter 1, explanation of standards, that's a good one. And I'll get into some of the other sections as we get through this, but it is very helpful. And as a peer reviewer, I go back to these because
Is solar panels on roofs? What are solar?
Depends on the solar panel. I'll take.
Yeah,
go ahead, stop doing a lot of stuff.
Well, I guess I'm asking, is that something that, because it can either be an asphalt roof or metal roof?
I believe
or hit
they're
solar panels?
considered clean.
Yeah, solar panels, the majority of the solar panels that you would see in Massachusetts are, well, probably all of them are inert and would be considered clean. There are some, like if you're researching toxicity of solar panels or things like that, you'll come up seeing a term cadmium telluride panels. That's not typically what's used in Massachusetts. I've been working on solar projects or reviewing them in some capacity since 2011, I think, and I've never seen a cadmium telluride solar panel. So they're considered clean, and they also, although this is something that DEP is still noodling around, I feel like, they're not considered impervious for your modeling purposes unless,
On the ground, you were
On the
talking
ground.
about on roofs, right?
yeah, oh, okay, never mind, yeah. They're not
We
impervious
can
on the
talk about that.
ground unless you have certain slopes. There's a whole policy about stormwater and solar panels from the state.
So what treatment would be required for a metal roof?
So I've done like a kind of a bioretention strip. So with different layers, stone, it can go on, come down, go onto the stone and then have bioretention underneath it.
Is this because of the temperature of the water coming off the metal roof is higher?
I don't know exactly. I'd have to look it up and see why.
The roofing, I think, is tricky because when we were talking about roofs, if you do like a word search under rooftop or whatever for rooftop runoff in the standards, it only comes up under recharge. So that's really the only language that discusses it. And what it says is it talks about that roof runoff from non-metal being discharged to a dry well without any pre-treatment.
Right.
So that has been, that's really all it says. And that has been expanded to, oh, it's clean. I can sort of do anything I want with it. And I sometimes struggle with that. Like you had said, it's clean. You don't have to treat it.
Right.
And it sort of says that, but it doesn't quite, in my opinion, and I want you guys to tell me more, kind of give as much free range as I think we often take with that. And I'm not saying I think it's dirty and needs to be pre-treated, but it really just says you can put it right directly in a dry well without pre-treatment. Which in a sense would be, in my mind, a little bit of a pre-treatment prior to discharge to a resource area, if I were to look at it that way, as opposed, you know what I mean? So if you're, because you're putting it in the infiltration system or something like that.
And it's being treated through the soil.
So kind of, they're saying you don't need to do anything additional, or you can
Pre-treat.
just do that, and that's good enough because it's clean enough. But it doesn't, I don't know, I didn't find language that says you can sort of do what you will with this.
Are there situations where, you're seeing folks do something other with it? So
Other than a dry well?
what comes, or that would be concerning, that wouldn't have treatment, so what comes to mind, and it's not stormwater related, so I think for stormwater purposes, it's clean because it doesn't need to be pre-treated, but I know, if you look on gardening sites, they will say, don't use your roof runoff to irrigate your vegetable garden,
Sure.
that kind of thing, but that's obviously not really germane to this discussion, but is it being discharged in a way that has you concerned for impacts to other interests or resource areas? Is it, because I feel like by it being considered clean without pre-treatment, then, it's saying there's not an impact to water quality, groundwater, surface water supplies, that kind of thing.
I do think temperature was probably one that is not
Mhm.
listed in there, but it
Yes.
is one that we would
Right.
think about.
Mhm.
So if you had a direct discharge from a roof to a surface water, potentially you could have a temperature gradient there.
Yeah.
I don't think that would be, could you have a direct discharge from a roof to the
No.
surface water?
If
Why
it's
not?
clean, if it's
You-
clean, why
well,
can't?
I mean, no, but
as
it's an
long as it doesn't cause
alteration piece.
erosion.
But it's an alteration that needs to be permitted, so you have to,
Okay.
and then you could say, okay, well, what about the temperature? Is that gonna alter the surface water? And they would have to say, okay, well, this is the temperature and this is the temperature of this, and then when you combine them, it's an insignificant
We'd have
change
to
or an
gather
insignificant-
information on what rooftop runoff temperature is, which
Right.
I don't have, or
Well,
I
but
don't
the
really know.
proponent, I mean, I think it would.
I would put it on
You would
that.
ask the proponent about it,
something
if
like
there is
that.
a case where a roof is discharging directly to a surface water.
Yeah, so you're thinking that they would manage the rest of the stormwater and so that they could just direct discharge the roof runoff? Like, that would be the only way to do it.
Could you do that?
Theoretically, yeah.
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 Cause it's considered clean, right?
Yeah. Well, in the TSS, now we're gonna get to standard 4, but the TSS removal requirement is 80%, so theoretically, if your roof is, even if you had some asphalt coming off on it,
Yeah, it's
is
not
it
gonna-
less than?
right.
It's not gonna be more than,
No.
80% TSS.
I was
Not
gonna ask
just
about
more
that
temp-
solar cell. What is it about the first solar cells, the cadmium telluride cells? that doesn't be considered clean?
And I don't wanna say that they're not considered clean, because I also am not a chemist, and all I know is when I represent solar developers and projects. And people say, solar panels poison, whatever, because that's a comment that comes up a lot with solar. And a lot of times, what's that?
Because of the cadmium.
And a lot of
Fish,
times
right.
people will say, cadmium telluride, because they've Googled something and seen that there are cadmium telluride solar panels, and then all the clients I've represented say, no, the panels we source are largely silica, or, it's not a cadmium telluride. So, but I believe that it is the cadmium telluride itself. Now, it may perfectly well be inert in that particular solar panel. I don't know.
It is, but
Yeah,
That's what.
It's
first
but
solar-
name.
but it's more of an abutter concern.
Yeah, you're gonna see,
that gets
you're gonna
raised.
see more and more because they're.
There are a lot of
harder to cover. And with
Someone Alex,
Like
tell you.
Yeah.
So just.
The cadmium telluride is gonna show up a lot more?
First Solar is the manufacturer of cadmium telluride cells.
Oh,
And they are an American company. And their production facilities, they're building a massive new one down in South now.
that's interesting. I'd
So.
be surprised if that starts happening in Massachusetts based
Well,
on the, but it
The company I
could.
used to work for just sourced about $1 billion.
Cadmium telluride solar
cells,
for a
solar
Massachusetts
cells.
project?
Well, no, for
Oh.
cell projects all over the north.
Yeah, yeah.
North
It very well could be, and like I said, it's not something we've ever had to cross because that's not what the developers I work with use, so they just say that's not what I use. But I just mention it in terms
Yeah,
of, there
I
are
mean,
different solar panels,
So we'll
so,
see it come up.
yeah, interesting.
I believe that the material is inert.
Right, it, you know, if it breaks, it's still inert, it's not like there's something that's gonna leak out, that's my understanding of it, but, you know, I defer to the solar developers to answer those questions when they come up, because that's their expertise. But
I
that's what
just
I've heard over
wasn't
time.
sure what you were saying, so thanks. for
Yeah.
clarifying.
Yep, yeah, absolutely.
Rebecca, are we limited on time here tonight, do you know?
Just whatever they're willing to give us.
Oh, because we had that issue before, right?
Yes, that's right, we don't any longer.
8:30 issue.
Yeah, they didn't have staff,
The
but
guy
there's-
downstairs, I asked, he said it's here till 10.
there we go.
Not that you wanna be here.
We
that-
won't-
I don't- not that I-
No matter how many questions you guys ask,
Not that I wanna be here that long.
No,
either,
no,
so-
no, it doesn't.
Wait, we're not moving in?
Okay, so standard 4 is treatment. I'm sure you've seen a lot of treatment, so street sweeping, catch basins, your swirl separators, people talk about vortechnic separators. You have to remove 80% of the total suspended solids from stormwater before discharging to the buffer zone. So this would be a whole train of things that happen before the discharge point. Pre-treatment is required, so one thing that's interesting about TSS removal is when you get into the next section, volume 2, chapter 2, this section is very specific structural BMPs and how you count.
BMPs.
We know that.
You know that one?
We do know that.
Best management practices. So each one is listed in this volume. And it tells you how much TSS removal you get from that particular BMP. It is also specific to tell you, just say for an extended detention basin, it has to have a forebay in the basin to get that 80% or the percentage, you know, that they're qualifying. So really look at the design criteria in that volume of how each thing is designed. 44% TSS removal, so typically pre-treatment is 25%. If you have a critical area, or if you have rapid infiltration rates, so your sandy areas, you need to treat 44% before it gets into your infiltration basins. We're continuing with standard 4. Now I'm talking through some of the things I already talked about. So separators, media filters, your swales, infiltration basins, here's your permeable pavement.
You know, I think a lot of towns are using less sand and more salt.
Yes, I think so.
So isn't that affecting? They have to test these chambers if they're still providing the same type of reduction.
So there's no testing requirement for the chambers, but there is long-term maintenance requirement for the chambers. So they do have to be vacuumed out annually to make sure that nothing's accumulating in it. I don't know how salt affects resource areas, or if, I mean, that's not something that is
Salt.
discussed in here.
Yeah, the salt is hazardous to vegetation,
Right.
not so much the animals. No limit to salt. No
Yeah,
danger.
but vegetation certainly, and then the other one that I'm not sure about, it's beyond kind of my knowledge base, but if you have a lot of salting near vernal pools, I've seen as a concern before as well, but I don't,
Amphibians.
yeah, but I don't know that it's a valid concern, I just have heard it raised before. But I mean, the salt presumably is not, you know, acting the same as TSS, because part of the concern about TSS is the fact that pollutants are bound to it, and
Attaching
that's,
to the sand.
yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right. So is it really clean? Water?
Well, it's not gonna remove the salt. It's also.
Right, no, it
Salt.
removes the
Because the salt
TSS.
is soluble.
Right, so the
that'll-
salt is, right, exactly,
There's no treatment, so.
right.
I mean, I think with this series of systems, by the time you get to the basin at the end and you're, getting water to go through, hopefully it's not, an impervious bottom. By that whole, hopefully you're cleaning the water by the time it gets to the outlet. So you are getting rid of salts either through how much, water is being added to it, so it's less.
Get rid of salt, it's soluble.
Well,
Well,
it's
dilutes.
soluble, dilutes, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that's the word I was looking for, it
Yeah.
dilutes with rainfall. So the nature-based BMPs, this kind of goes back to the low impact development, so rain gardens, bioretention gardens, constructed wetlands, wet basins, and green roofs, which I'm seeing a lot more of, because I'm doing a lot of work in the city now.
So how do you tell, I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that if a wet basin is not maintained, it's considered wet. What about these other measures, rain garden? Bioretention?
Yeah, they still have to be maintained,
And if
or
they're not,
they can,
end up becoming wetland as well.
They
subject
could.
To our regular.
That's kind, I'll just jump in on that, so it's kind of a town by town decision, so if it was post 1996 and it was maintained. And it's been maintained, then no, it's definitely not subject, it's explicitly stated that it's not subject to jurisdiction as a wetland.
So.
If it's
so long as it's
pre-19
maintained,
Yeah, if it's pre 1996.
Fine.
If it's, yeah, so long as it's maintained, if it's pre 1996, then it's sort of up to date, as far as I'm aware, up to the towns. And every town does differently. Plymouth, I had a site where the basin had sumac taller than me, which isn't saying much, I'm sure, but, it was quite overgrown, like it'd been growing for at least 20 years. Since the last since the last time they maintained it. And in Plymouth, they don't want to take jurisdiction of something that was intended as a stormwater facility, because they want it to be able to be reverted to its intended use so that it functions. Personally, I think that's the better approach. So for them, as long as you can demonstrate, yes, this was intended to be a stormwater basin, and so we had a plan from, I think it was somewhere in the 80s, that labeled it as a stormwater basin. And so they allowed the client, even though they had not maintained it for decades,
Yeah.
to go in and clean it out.
Make
Other
it-
Yeah,
towns,
I was gonna say conversely, I
Yep.
have a project in Southborough and the basins were never maintained and Southborough said, nope, you can no longer use those as stormwater basins. Those are our
They're fine.
jurisdiction and put your
Yeah.
basin somewhere else.
All the things that, not necessarily for the result, but for the incentivized, to put incentives on. Because right now, they feel like there isn't maintenance in there, and it's not viewed as, fairly. And that's why I was thinking, this you said about, putting the, featuring those things as certificates of compliance.
Mhm,
And it's,
right, in terms of
it's really,
explaining.
it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick one? What's country drainage?
Country drainage is what you see, so I see it more in Plymouth and sandy areas. It's
Okay.
much easier in sandy areas, so. Bituminous roadway pitched to the sides and, little swales along
Just
the
like a little
side,
grass gutter?
Yeah.
little grass gutter.
That's it. So just away from the curb and catch basin scenario?
Yeah, no curbs and no catch, no
Okay.
curbs. You can probably add catch basins for larger storms so that you're not sending it all to
Like
your
in the
grass
bottom of the
swales.
grass swale or something, okay,
Yeah.
okay, and that's considered, because that's a low impact design,
That's a
right?
low impact development,
Okay.
yeah.
What I was gonna ask is that, we're presented with plans that show best man, I don't know how we as a commission are able to tell they have the right number of catch basins, the right number. I mean, you have to rely on their stormwater, and that's why you need a peer reviewer. I don't know how there's no way, right, I can tell that.
So, I mean, I think Stacy and I agree. I think it's very tough for a commission,
To say, sure, that's fine.
unless you have a PE on the board that does stormwater.
Right.
And you're like, because I've been to some commissions
Yeah.
where I'll argue with the PE on.
You ever have commissions that just sort of have like a tickler, that would, in a situation where you have ongoing requirements, that they would just have a tickler every year sent out. here's your reminder that you, you know. of the,
What's a tickler? What do you mean?
So, yeah,
It's like a notify you, you have a calendar file. It's like a calendar that notifies.
so Westboro,
No,
the agent in Westboro for maintenance? Is that
Yeah.
what for maintenance?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes,
So the
Anything.
agent that was in Westboro,
Derek.
Derek, sorry, in Westboro. Agent, he would do that every single year. Hey, guess what? You gotta maintain your basin. And he would
Wow.
more like drive around town and go, okay, they haven't maintained,
Right.
they haven't
They would
maintained.
see,
and he
you
would
see what's wrong.
And you would say, that's what I remind you.
Yeah.
This requirement.
Yeah,
And
just
you
give me
just-
more.
He must have been a full-time agent, I'm sure.
He was a full, he
Oh,
was a
yeah.
full-time.
Just, you print something out.
It
it's
also-
a phone letter, you know, you
Just wait till I get to hear the bad news and then I jump in.
just reminding you
Right.
of your, this is just your annual reminder of
And
your
what some
obligations
towns-
to do this. And
That would be great, to be honest with you, because
it's
we
so
get it
easy
at when
to do.
something fails.
Right.
And then it's an enforcement
And-
situation or it's one of those,
when-
that's just
well, when
unfortunately how
people
we all
know
do.
that there is no way that you're paying attention. No one, you know, they just, assume no one's gonna care if they don't do it.
Yeah.
And
The other thing
just
that
wanna
some,
introduce the possibility that.
right,
Yeah.
And we're, you know. Okay.
my town is looking at sending out, not necessarily stormwater specific, I'm supposed to be doing it for invasive species, but with tax mailings, putting just an insert, so you could do the same thing, you know. Don't forget the commission exists and this is our jurisdiction, also if you have stormwater BMPs, maintain them, or it's, you know,
Wow.
and that way you're
That
not
would
paying
definitely
extra
have
postage.
It's a great idea.
Just that way you don't have to deal with a separate billing, but
That is a great idea, absolutely.
What's
So glad you're gonna do it, Teresa.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
ORWs and SRWs.
outstanding resource waters. I don't know what it is. I don't-
Surface resource water. Yeah, it's gotta be.
It's funny, I didn't notice that when we gave this presentation last time, and
No, I didn't either.
that is not an acronym that I use.
No, I don't either.
And
I think
what's
it's a
a-
surface resource.
What's a
Yeah.
CVP?
Certified vernal
Certified
pool
vernal pool.
Oh,
and
course.
potential vernal pool. for
Oh,
PVP,
potential well.
which we'll talk about a little bit.
So with land uses with higher potential pollutant loads, we call them levels. And discharges. And discharges near critical areas, there's very specific source controls and pollution prevention, pre-treatment requirements. For Lupples specifically, like gas stations, very specific requirements for making sure you have shut-offs so that you have a way to contain any type of spills. So that's really important if you have any types of projects like that. Lupples can also include parking lots that have a lot of vehicle trips, so 1,000 vehicle trips a day. So like some of your large shopping centers, if they have 1,000 vehicle trips. Vehicle service stations, equipment cleaning areas, anybody that has like an exterior fleet storage would fall under that. And they have to treat, so typically under standard 4, you're only treating a 1/2 inch of, so it's called your first flush, you're treating a 1/2 inch of rainfall. Under these, you're treating an inch of rainfall. And you have the pre-treatment requirements, which I mentioned before, which is the 44% instead of the 25%.
Does treating that extra 1/2 inch just mean that everything's basically bigger or there are more there's like, if you had chambers or something, you just have to have more of them?
Yeah, and you would typically have your swirl chambers, like if you had any of those, they would be designed for a higher flow that would go through. them.
Okay.
So it could just be a larger chamber.
Just more expensive.
Yeah, more expensive.
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And the critical areas, do you wanna go through them?
No, you
Okay.
go ahead.
So surface resource waters apparently, I'm still not convinced about that, I'm
I'm
gonna write
not
it down
either.
too, I don't have a pen if you're writing it
No.
down, but yeah, so we can look up what that is, but outstanding resource waters, so. Those are areas designated by the state, they include certified vernal pools, there's a whole list that you can look at to see if you're in an outstanding resource water. The surface water protection zones, wellhead protection areas, shellfish growing areas, areas of critical environmental concern. Not all ACECs, I don't think, but specific ones, and then vernal pools, like I noted. These are things that are more readily checked by the commission. And these are things that I do see errors on, where someone says, are you in you have to answer, are you in any critical areas? No, I'm not. Well, guess what, you are, or you're discharging to a vernal pool. It doesn't mean a direct discharge to.
Right.
I forget what the language is.
Near or,
In the vicinity of, or
Yeah.
it's, if your discharge is going towards the vernal pool, consider yourself discharging to
To
an
the vernal
ORW.
right.
The reason I put potential vernal pools up there is because, if it is certifiable, right? Like if it's not certified by, does everyone know what okay, so if it's not certified yet by Natural Heritage, but someone's looked at it and it meets all the criteria to be certified, our practice would be that we treat it as if it's a certified and therefore an outstanding resource water. Whether or not that holds up in a legal battle, maybe not. But I think if it's raised during the notice of intent process, then it typically does. And that's also something where I see folks being maybe a little bit too cavalier with the discharging to, you know what I mean? Like they're close to it, but saying they're not discharging to it, or and this isn't quite stormwater necessarily, but modeling the stormwater for the whole wetland system instead of looking more specifically at where the vernal pool is in that wetland to make sure that the vernal pool
Continues to
as
get
much,
flow,
continues
isn't
to get the
changed, right, right.
hydrology. So you maybe
Right, we
want to
didn't
make sure
talk
that the
about that.
flows aren't shunting off, somewhere else.
It's a special resource water. It's very special.
Special resource
Special
water, thank you,
resource
that
water.
sounds,
14
that
more.
sounds familiar. So, Amanda, stuff? Did I say
Yes, so
something? Okay.
7 redevelopments. So a project is only considered a redevelopment if there is no net increase in impervious area. If they increase the impervious area, they cannot claim this. But basically under this, so if they are reducing or keeping impervious areas the same, they have to include new stormwater controls to improve over existing conditions. And they should show you that. There is a redevelopment checklist. It's not a checklist. I personally think it's awful. It's like pages and pages of words. But I would have them do the regular checklist and have them go through each of the standards and tell you how they're improving or, upon existing conditions.
And the other thing that I'll point out is that this redevelopment is different than riverfront area redevelopment.
Right.
Two separate and totally exclusive things.
Yes.
So one can be a redevelopment for stormwater, but not a riverfront redevelopment, and vice versa.
So if you are redevelopment, right, and then, but a portion of the site is, all right, so you have, let's suppose you have an existing discharge. And there's not any treatment, so they're going to redevelop and they're gonna provide some upstream treatment prior to that discharge. What if they develop a whole new area and there's a new discharge that's going to join the existing? Is that considered new, or does that get subject to the redevelopment, or do you separate them?
The new stuff would all be new development and they would have to meet all the standards. If they're discharging to the same in your jurisdiction, yeah.
Okay, so I thought.
So 8 is erosion and sediment control, so this would be, can I use an acronym? This would be your SWIP, your stormwater pollution prevention plan. So any site greater than an acre of land disturbance requires an EPA. This is through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems. System.
Isn't that the NP?
NPDES, yep.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we call it. Or a construction period pollution prevention plan, which is what the regulations call it. Yeah. Very super important, you guys know, during construction. So this plan and what people are showing on their erosion and sediment control plans, hugely important. Where are their barriers? If they have steep slopes, are there multiple barriers? How are they going to prevent a blowout during construction? And I will tell you, with the rains that we've had many sites that have had issues, and more not because of the design. So the engineer could engineer the plan perfectly and you guys are reviewing that plan, but it's watching the contractor.
And a lot of dewatering too, I suspect.
Yep, dewatering.
Probably recently, there's probably more of that on sites than they were anticipating.
Yeah, and the dewatering, it's better if they can dewater into a pit in the soil rather than dewater to grade, because you're always gonna get chocolate milk, you know, when you go to grade. You have to just somehow get that sediment to settle out. So if it's in a pit, it's gonna work a lot better. Chocolate milk. Long-term operation and maintenance plan, standard 9. We've talked about this quite a bit. Make sure you get the final at the end of a project with your certificate of compliance. It has a responsible party, so it has the owner's name, their contact information. Who they're using for maintenance is great too, because a lot of the maintenance companies, they'll give reports for what they've pumped out, how much they've pumped out. And what they've cleaned. It's harder when your maintenance people are like the landscaping crew, or you have like a homeowners association, because they're not gonna fill out the paperwork. The owner really is gonna have to do it.
You can change landscaping companies, plowing.
Exactly,
Year.
exactly. It's really hard. And number 10 is prohibition of illicit discharges to the stormwater management system. So illicit discharges are anything like a sewer that happens to be going, and it happens more in
Like
older
changing their
systems.
oil and.
Floor drain.
Yeah, floor drains,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah. Okay, so this is kind of where we're getting into like more of the nitty gritty, and tell me where you want to stop and if you guys have any questions on it, but. This is talking about the stormwater management report and what you should expect to see when you get one. If you guys are reviewing it, you know, this is what you're gonna see. So you're gonna show, it's gonna show compliance, should show compliance, and go through each of the standards and tell you how they're complying with each of the standards. And then for redevelopment, if a standard cannot be met, it should tell you why it can't be met and how water quality and quantity will be protected or increased. So what documentation must be submitted with reports? So the checklist really does help with this. So the checklist goes through each of the standards and tells you what has to be provided for each of the standards. So it should show all of your wetlands, resource areas, your soil type. So make sure they have testing in their basin areas, because I've seen a lot. They go to construction and then all of a sudden there is high groundwater or there's ledge. No, we can't put the basin here. I know that's why you should have had your testing in the basin area. It should show all their discharge locations, so that's when you can see if it's near and affecting a resource area. We mentioned this one before, outlet protection design. How big is the riprap apron? Are they actually dissipating velocities so that it doesn't cause erosion downstream? It's going to have probably some type of model in it that has existing and proposed runoff rates. So normally what we do is we have a table, it says existing for pre-development, post-development, and tells you what the 2, 10, and 100-year storms and does the comparison for you. But then there's backup that is included. Infiltration volumes. So infiltration requirements, those are in volume 3, and it depends on the soils you have on site. And they have to show you that they are at least meeting the requirements of, this is volume 3, chapter 1, documenting compliance. It goes through each of the standards and tells you what you need in your stormwater report and what you have to calculate. So everything in volume 3 should be in your stormwater report. It will give you your BMP treatment train. So this is when you see street sweeping, catch basin, vortechnic units, and then your basin or your infiltration system. And it tells you how much TSS it's removing from each of those steps. And then the other ones we talked about, the lupels, the critical areas, if it's a redevelopment, and the others.
What's the last one, the illicit discharge statement?
So that's the illicit discharge statement. So they are supposed to write to you and say, we certify that there are no illicit discharges on this property. So I don't have any floor drains connected into my stormwater system. I don't have any sewers connected into my stormwater system.
And I don't know about other firms, but for us, that's typically something that the landowner signs.
Yes, landowners would sign it. So these are some of the things that we just put a little slide together, what the commission can look for, make sure it's signed and stamped by a professional engineer. Make sure you look at the table and the post-development peak discharge rate is less than or equal to the pre-development discharge rate. You can look at, they would typically have maps showing existing and proposed drainage areas. And make sure that they generally look like the same area, yeah.
Why
add
would
it.
they not? That did happen to us very recently. And our town engineer corrected it, but I remember when you guys were talking through with Alicia, when she did that, you mentioned that as well. And
Yeah.
it was literally like the next day. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, I just heard about this. Yeah, right. So what
So
would be what would
in
be
the
the
past,
mistake there, or why would?
so
okay.
in the past, I've seen it as a game. Maybe to like say,
Yeah,
oh, I
that's right.
had more under existing, so I have less under proposed, to like kind of say I have more runoff under pre-development conditions. Sometimes
Oh,
it's just an error.
right.
Sometimes they may have drainage going off-site in a different direction.
Yes.
So that could happen, but the total area should still be the same.
Okay,
So those are some of the things that can happen.
okay.
While we're mentioning sort of games or errors. The other thing, and I don't know if it's still happening with as much frequency as I was once seeing it, but the other sort of number monkeying that can happen is when you pick your cover type for the
Yes.
modeling. So you have fair,
Woods good,
right,
so
woods good.
it should be woods good.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be seeing woods fair if it's a pristine site.
If it's a normal forest, it's woods good.
Yes. So basically what it's talking about is what kind of cover you have underneath the tree canopy. So it's your organic mat, your leaf litter,
yeah.
your brush, all of that, your blueberries, whatever's underneath there, that all contributes to woods good.
It's not like a
It's-
physical interception, is that why, like, why would that be different than like a wood or grass?
So it's how much water infiltrates and is kind of absorbed within that system. So if you
So this lets
say
run up your
that
sand
it was under the existing condition Woods Fair, and I'm gonna make it a good meadow,
Right.
your runoff rates,
It's gonna
are the same.
automatically go, right.
and you don't have to mitigate anything. Well, I
Right.
mean, I'm hyperbolizing
right.
a bit,
Oh,
but
I
it makes
see what
the
you're
numbers, it makes less of a difference between those two numbers that you need to design for. And so for a while, especially when there were a few folks that did have PEs, but they weren't consultant firms, I will
Right,
say. They
right.
were developer firms that were kind of playing that game.
But DEP Central, they will
Oh, yeah, they
always
review
comment, it should say was good, like it existing.
And
Tree
there-
covered area, that's what.
And
it
there
should
have
be.
been times, I forget which project it was, but I think you and I had talked about it, where we did get a comment from DEP and we disagreed with what the characterization is that they were saying, and we kind of looked into it. So I'm not saying, that there's not room for interpretation, but that's one thing to check, is just what they're saying.
So,
their pre and post
Does everybody,
information is.
you asked about the different cover types and
Yep.
kind of, so woods, a woodland is gonna absorb a lot more water than a grass.
Right,
yeah.
And then obviously impervious
Like the
areas are
curb
gonna run
numbers
up.
that-
Yes,
Yeah, and
exactly.
I see that they do list them out.
Yeah.
And, I would not have thought of that.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't check that.
Yes,
That's what
right,
the
right.
town engineer would
Right.
check, but it's good
Yes,
to know, I
yeah.
wanna know.
So soil classification is another big one. Make sure they tell you what they've researched, so NRCS is the National Conservation, Natural.
Resource Conservation Service.
What she said. So typically I start there to see what types of soils are on my site, but the handbook does require you to go to testing. You're supposed to do testing on the whole site to see if the soils match what the NRCS says the soils are, and then you have to do testing specifically in your BMP areas.
So you do it in both, and that's the ABCD, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And the ABCD is gonna tell you how much water can go into the ground. It's gonna tell you what your infiltration requirements are, and it's gonna tell you how you're sizing your infiltration basins. So I said here, the number of test bits meets 1 per acre, plus testing in BMPs, so that's kind of important. your TSS removal and pre-treatment values, so going through that treatment train and making sure. So one thing that's interesting about TSS removal is you can't just take a catch basin, 25%, and add it to a standard detention basin, which I think is 60%. So you can't say that's 85. As soon as you do the 25% TSS removal from a catch basin, it decreases the amount of TSS you have. So it's less though, they're not additive, is kind of what I'm saying on that. And
65% of 75.
yeah, exactly, right.
Right.
7, make sure all the critical areas are identified and really go through that list.
Yeah.
Because that one is one Stacy mentioned, we find that
Yeah.
people miss that
Like
all the time.
bathing beaches, there are things that aren't readily mapped. Even cold water fisheries, the mapping was updated and not reflected on Mass Mapper for, I think, a year or something like that. So there were sites that we had that, were cold water fisheries that weren't identified when we were doing peer review. That we said
Mass
peer review.
Mapper is one of the best.
Yes,
sites
there's so
for
much
all
more
this. Yeah, a
desktop
lot more.
information available.
Yep.
And that I do want to also say, so this presentation, we tried to make it helpful and handy, and you can certainly use it as a reference, but like when Paula says, look at the list of critical areas, she doesn't mean the list in our slide. Look at, go back to the origin document, to the
Exactly.
handbook.
Exactly.
Uh,
And I will say, when I am reviewing doing a peer review, I am going to volume 2, chapter 2, and going through each of the criteria in here. It gives you offsets from slopes, gives you offsets from foundations for each of the different types
Surface
of
waters.
BMPs,
Yeah.
surface waters,
Yeah.
yeah.
Which is wetlands.
Yes. Surface waters, wetlands.
Yep.
So this is a slide just talking about different BMP checks for a commission. You're out at a site, you're seeing sand plumes at your outfalls or catch basins. I love this photo with just sand, nobody's swept or,
Yeah,
I don't know how
it's
many years. Stressed vegetation, which we talked about with salts and sands, obviously litter, and failure to drain within 72 hours. So we've had a couple basins recently, actually, not draining in 72 hours. That's the requirement for an infiltration basin. It has to drain, because it has to be ready and available with that volume for the next storm. And they predicted Mass, we get storms generally every 3 days. So that's where that requirement comes in. One of the things that we found with basins not draining, it's typically because of what's happening during construction. So all that sediment, that runoff and the sediment, it's just sitting on the bottom, it's coating your whole basin bottom, and it is clogging all your soil pores, so nothing is gonna go in. So one of the things that we've done for remediation, take out the whole bottom, you can put stone in the bottom, you can put filter fabric, crushed stone, and just keep it cleaner. And sometimes you have to do that after construction is finished, essentially, because everything upstream has to be stable already.
They may have used that to dewater into
They may have.
and never cleaned it out.
Yes.
Who would inspect that though? Who would do that? Who would be? Do you guys ever do that? I mean, is part of your, work?
Construction administration, like overseeing the
Well,
installation.
you
of the
said
basin.
you would after this construction is complete,
Right.
making sure there's not.
Oh.
So we've done it on projects
Who would otherwise
because
do it? Who would otherwise, I mean, the agent?
I think
conservation?
the town, yeah, anybody in town that saw it, like
They
if you're
probably have.
DPW or,
Okay.
It probably has something in there that says that they're not gonna get paid until they pipes are all inspected and clean.
I mean, on our projects, it's the owner or developer is saying, why is there still water in that basin?
Yeah.
Because it's, mosquito issue and.
Yeah.
And isn't there a requirement that they put in when they did that last big revision to the forms? Remember, Rich brought it up internally that like you have, when you're doing your COC, there's this whole stormwater kind of review and sign off that needs to happen. So, things like that can get, not necessarily the drawdown, because you might not
Right,
see
right,
it
might not
in the,
see it.
yeah, but get checked there. What was I gonna say? Oh, basins during construction. I think the state handbook doesn't allow, or at least speaks strongly against using basins for construction. However, I will say, sometimes you have to do it. Like, sometimes there's no other
That
place
is at
to
the bottom.
put,
Right.
but it is important during construction to make sure that you're not compacting the bottom of that basin, and that when everything is done and the site is stable, you do go in and remove all the fines that accumulated there, so.
And what I've seen, for basin bottoms on design plans is keep the bottom of the basin high during
Yes.
construction. So then when you go back in afterwards, you can take that whole bottom, that whole layer out, you know, whatever it is, 6 inches, 8 inches, you can take it all out at the end.
Right, to reach finished grade, yeah.
We've had homeowners come to us and purchased a house with a basin, and they don't want it in the backyard, you know, mosquitoes, or they don't want the little kids falling in, and.
Drowning hazard.
Drowning hazard, yep, yep. and they
Yeah.
wanna-
Right.
wanna
And it's the
bury it.
basin for the whole subdivision.
Yep.
So
Right.
it's
Yep,
not going
they
anywhere.
want buried chambers or some other option.
Yeah.
Oh,
So this second paragraph here is kind of goes into volume 2, chapter 2, as I mentioned. And you cannot have a BMP within a zone A, you cannot have a BMP within 100 feet of a certified vernal
So
pool.
BMP, I thought was best management plan.
yes, yeah,
So
so,
But these are any of your basins, so any type of infiltration basin, extended detention basin cannot be within any of these areas.
and that's something that,
With the vernal pool part, wasn't that in part of the recent, ruling or whatever it is, vernal pools not fall under our jurisdiction in some way?
oh, you're thinking of the federal waters of the United States, so. Vernal pools are not a resource area under this, so two separate things, you have the state law and you have the federal law. Depending on where the vernal pool is,